Kat Montgomery sat at the Montgomery family estate's grand hall, encased in designer silk and suffocating under the weight of expectations. The engagement announcement was supposed to happen tonight. Her mother, Marion, flitted around the room like a queen bee, whispering her plans to friends and family. An arranged marriage with Peter Blackwell, the esteemed older businessman, Marion had handpicked for her daughter. Kat watched Peter from across the room. He was laughing with a group of men twice his age, holding a cigar with the air of someone who owned everything in his line of sight, including her. Kat's stomach twisted. As Marion directed her into Peter's line of vision with a proprietary nudge, Kat turned abruptly and excused herself, slipping through the crowd and out onto the balcony. The cool night air was like a balm on her flushed skin. She took a shaky breath, feeling the dread coil tighter in her chest. She wasn't a prize to be handed over, and she wouldn't be Peter Blackwell's trophy wife. But how to escape the trap her family had set? Her phone buzzed with messages from her mother, no doubt noticing her absence from Peter's side. With a flash of rebellion, Kat silenced her phone, slipped off her heels, and in a hasty blur, sprinted out of the estate, sliding into her car with one goal: freedom. She sped out of town and drove through the night, her thoughts finally clearing with each mile. By dawn, she'd reached the coast, finding a sleepy, unassuming seaside town. Here, she was nobody. And that anonymity was bliss. It was here, at a dimly lit beachside bar, that she met Ryan Hastings. He was tall, rugged, with a bemused smile that seemed to see right through her. When he asked what she was running from, she laughed and deflected, but he didn't push. Instead, they drank and talked about everything except the truth. Family, dreams, regrets, and the freedom they both craved. He told her he'd come to escape a job he couldn't stand, and she told him she was running from her future. After hours of conversation, Kat noticed the time. Her phone buzzed incessantly with angry texts from her mother, her father, even Peter himself. There was no going back now. She had burned that bridge the moment she'd walked out of the estate. Turning to Ryan with a wild glint in her eye, she blurted out, "What if you and I just got married?" Ryan stared, surprised, before a smirk crept onto his face. "Marriage? With a woman I've known for 3 hours?" "Why not?" she replied with a shrug. "Marriage of convenience. You get a break from your life and I get the escape I need." They locked eyes, and he saw something in her that mirrored the chaos in himself. They drove to the closest chapel that afternoon, their hearts pounding with reckless energy. With the lazy afternoon sun casting golden light over them, they exchanged vows, half laughing and half serious, but a spark of something genuine passed between them as they said, "I do." When they returned to the Montgomery estate, Kat's family was waiting, fury etched on Marion's face. Her mother's eyes widened, then narrowed on Ryan as Kat announced, "This is my husband." The air was thick with tension. Peter, standing beside Marion, looked like he might combust, and Kat reveled in the shock of it all. For once, she was free and her family was forced to deal with it. Ryan played along with a confidence that matched hers, weaving a believable story about how they'd met and fallen in love in the heat of a moment. Marion, however, was far from convinced. She studied Ryan like a puzzle, desperate to find the weak link in his narrative. But Ryan, with his steady gaze and easy charm, held his ground. By evening, both Kat's and Ryan's families were brought together to discuss the situation. Kat's father, his mouth set in a grim line, drilled Ryan with questions about his intentions. Kat watched, holding her breath, but Ryan deflected each inquiry with poise, even throwing in a few playful remarks that charmed Kat's father just enough to keep him at bay. When the evening finally ended, Kat and Ryan found themselves alone, sharing a conspiratorial smile. "So, husband," she teased, her voice laced with amusement. He grinned, taking her hand. "Let's see how long we can keep this charade going, Mrs. Hastings." They both knew they were in way over their heads, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The breakfast table at the Montgomery estate was more like a battlefield. Kat's family had gathered, with her mother, Marion, at the head, her eyes steely as she sipped her coffee, assessing Kat and Ryan with an icy silence. Kat tried to eat her toast calmly, feeling Marion's gaze burn holes into her, but every bite was forced. Her father, a man of few words, looked at Ryan with a combination of suspicion and resentment, barely acknowledging his son-in-law as more than an interloper. Across the table, her cousin Amy watched them, her eyes gleaming with thinly veiled satisfaction. "So, Kat," Amy said, her voice oozing sweetness with an edge, "how does it feel to be a Hastings now? Quite the quick decision, don't you think?" Kat braced herself. She knew Amy was here not to celebrate, but to pick apart her story. Marion raised an eyebrow, waiting for Kat's response, while Ryan took a sip of his coffee, giving Amy a smile that was both charming and challenging. "When you know," he said, his arm slipping protectively around Kat's shoulder. But he wasn't just holding her, he was anchoring her, giving her courage. "Oh, I'm sure," Amy said, her lips twitching in a smirk. "Though some would call it impulsive or even reckless." She cast a quick glance at Marion, her words intentionally crafted to plant seeds of doubt in her aunt's mind. Marion's eyes narrowed slightly, and Kat felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just family concern. This was a scheme. As they left breakfast, Kat pulled Ryan aside in the hallway, her voice low. "Watch out for Amy. She won't stop until she finds something to ruin this for us." Ryan nodded, looking back at the dining room where he could still see Amy's calculating smile. "Understood, but I think she'll be disappointed." The schemes began to surface in subtle ways. Amy would, accidentally, bring up embarrassing moments from Kat's past, spinning stories of her recklessness that clashed with the image of a newly devoted wife. She'd throw in comments like, "Remember that time Kat thought she was in love with that art student?" Her words were carefully chosen, designed to paint Kat as a flighty girl with a habit of bad decisions. Marion, meanwhile, took another approach. She began pressing Ryan with questions about his plans, his career, his income, his family. One morning, she invited Ryan to a private discussion in her study, where she sat him down, offering tea and a cold, calculating smile. "Ryan," she began, her voice smooth but with a hard edge, "I'd like to know what kind of future you see for my daughter. You don't come from our world. Do you think you can really provide for her?" Ryan kept his composure, sensing the test behind her words. "With all due respect, Mrs. Montgomery, I think it's less about the world we come from and more about the world we can build together." His answer was polite yet firm, and it unsettled Marion just enough to leave him alone, for the moment. Yet, Marion wasn't the only one concerned. Kat's father started planting seeds of doubt directly in Kat's mind. He would pull her aside, reminding her of the responsibilities she'd taken on as a Montgomery, the family legacy, and the social obligations that her marriage had disrupted. "This isn't a game, Kat," he'd say, his voice almost pitying. "One day, you'll regret throwing away your future on a whim." The relentless push from her parents began to wear on Kat, and soon she found herself questioning if she could keep up the facade. But Ryan never wavered, standing by her in every encounter, his calm resilience helping her face the onslaught. The final straw came when Amy arranged for an old friend of Kat's to stop by during a family gathering, an ex-boyfriend named Will, whose presence caught Kat off guard. Will was charming, polished, and very much the person Marion would have approved of. "Just thought I'd come by and say hello," he said with a smile that lingered a bit too long. Amy watched them like a hawk, waiting for Kat's resolve to slip. But Ryan stepped in, greeting Will with a handshake and an unflinching gaze. He slipped an arm around Kat, his fingers tightening on her shoulder. "We're grateful for old friends," he said, his voice warm but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "But we're looking to the future now." Amy's plans were temporarily thwarted, but the tension between the families was now at a breaking point. Ryan and Kat were in it together, but they both knew the war had just begun. As days passed, Kat felt the tension around her tightening like a noose. She noticed the veiled glances her father, Tom, shared with her mother over dinner, the kind exchanged when people know more than they're willing to say. And then there were the little things, too. The hushed phone calls Tom would take, often slipping away to his study, or the business meetings that were conveniently scheduled when Ryan was around, as if to remind him of the wealth and power he'd married into. Ryan, however, was no stranger to secrets of his own. Despite his cool exterior, he seemed on edge, occasionally excusing himself to make phone calls. Kat couldn't overhear. He'd come back with a guarded look in his eyes, and when she'd ask him about it, he'd brush it off with a dismissive grin. But the intrigue only deepened when Kat began to notice odd, seemingly insignificant details. an envelope marked with a strange crest in Ryan's belongings, a set of keys she hadn't seen before, and, most unsettling of all, a photograph of a woman she didn't recognize, folded neatly and tucked into his wallet. Her curiosity soon turned to suspicion. Late one night, when Ryan had left the room, Kat slipped the photo from his wallet and studied it under the lamplight. The woman was beautiful, her gaze warm and familiar. Who was she? And why did Ryan keep her photo so close? Kat's mind raced with questions, each one filling her with unease. Determined to uncover the truth, she began investigating on her own, digging through old family records, emails, and even scrolling through public records on her father's past business dealings. To her shock, she discovered that Tom had a long-standing rivalry with Ryan's family, particularly with Ryan's father, who had been a silent partner in one of Tom's failed ventures years ago. It seemed the Hastings and Montgomery names had crossed paths before, and not amicably. One evening, as she pieced together fragments of these family ties, she confronted Ryan. "Who is she?" she asked, holding up the photo. Ryan's face froze for a moment, but he recovered quickly, taking a deep breath. "Her name's Claire," he admitted finally, his voice steady but with a hint of regret. "We had a history. She was someone I once thought I'd marry, but she passed away in an accident years ago." The revelation hit Kat hard. She sensed the depth of his past with this woman, an invisible connection that lingered between them, even if Ryan was no longer tied to her in life. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, hurt edging into her voice. "Because I didn't want you to think I was still living in the past," he replied, his gaze steady. "We may have married for convenience, Kat, but that doesn't mean I wanted to bring unnecessary baggage into this." Yet, even as he said the words, Kat felt an unshakable sense that there was more he wasn't telling her. Driven by her suspicions, she took matters into her own hands, paying a visit to Ryan's family estate under the guise of getting to know them better. Linda, Ryan's mother, welcomed her with an icy politeness that bordered on hostility. Her tone was deceptively pleasant as she asked probing questions about Kat's upbringing, her intentions, and even her family's wealth. But Kat noticed the nervous glances Linda exchanged with her husband, James, every time Kat mentioned her own father. Kat seized the moment, asking innocently, "I heard my father and your family were acquainted once? Something about a business deal years ago?" Linda's smile faltered, and for a brief second, her mask slipped. "Yes, well, that was a long time ago," she replied, her voice tight. Best to leave old business in the past. But Kat couldn't let it go. As she was leaving, she accidentally took a wrong turn in their house, ending up in a study where she discovered a dusty ledger lying open on a desk. The ledger listed several old investments, including one with Tom Montgomery's name, alongside Ryan's father's. And scribbled in the margins were cryptic notes about debts, broken promises, and betrayals. She quickly snapped a photo of the page before slipping back out. That night, Kat confronted Ryan once again, this time with the evidence. "Our families were more than just acquainted, weren't they?" she demanded, holding up the photo of the ledger. "What's really going on here?" Ryan's shoulders slumped, the calm facade he'd maintained finally cracking. "Yes, Kat," he admitted, defeated. "Our marriage was more than a spontaneous decision. It was my father and your father. They have a history, and when they heard we'd met, they saw an opportunity. Agreed to marry you to fulfill their twisted plans, but somewhere along the line, it stopped being just that for me." Kat felt a mix of betrayal and anger, but also a strange relief. "So what happens now?" Ryan met her gaze, his voice low but resolute. "Now we decide if we're playing by their rules or ours." The morning after their heated confrontation, Kat and Ryan returned to a tenuous peace, each aware that they were wading into dangerous territory, with secrets still rippling under the surface. They tried to put up a united front, but a new threat was lurking, one that neither of them had anticipated. It began with a call from Jessica, Ryan's ex, her voice sweet yet sharp over the phone. "Ryan," she cooed, "I had no idea you'd gotten married. Isn't that just a surprise?" Her words dripped with mock innocence, as if she hadn't already seen every tabloid headline about his sudden marriage to a mysterious heiress. She didn't ask for permission to visit. She simply announced she'd be dropping by to catch up. Before Ryan could protest, the line went dead, leaving him tense with anticipation of what her visit might mean. When Jessica arrived, she was nothing short of striking. A tall, poised woman with a predatory smile, dressed in an outfit that commanded attention. She wasted no time sizing up Kat with an arched brow and a smug smirk. "So," she said, her gaze flicking between them, "married life suits you, Ryan. Though I have to wonder how quickly you moved on." Kat felt the sting of Jessica's words, but she held her ground, her hand slipping into Ryan's as if to claim her space. Jessica didn't miss a beat, and her smile only grew more dangerous. She played the part of the concerned ex, making offhand comments about her history with Ryan, dropping casual anecdotes about shared trips and private jokes, each one designed to remind Kat of her place as the outsider. Ryan tried to keep the situation under control, steering Jessica's attention away from Kat with polite but firm conversation. But Jessica's gaze lingered on him, her eyes filled with a challenge. "You remember that little getaway in Napa, don't you, Ryan?" she purred, her voice low and intimate. "Seems like yesterday. Some memories are hard to shake." When Jessica finally left, Kat felt rattled, but before she could confront Ryan, she received an unexpected text from her own past. Alex, her former flame, who seemed to have discovered her sudden marriage. "So, you're married now?" His message read, laced with curiosity and just enough bitterness to remind her of the complicated past they'd shared. In an act of uncharacteristic boldness, Alex showed up the next day, slipping into the Montgomery estate like he belonged. He greeted Kat with a smile that was just a little too familiar, his gaze lingering on her as if he could still claim a piece of her heart. Ryan watched the interaction with growing discomfort, feeling the tension rise as Alex leaned in close to speak to Kat, his voice soft but with an undeniable edge of possessiveness. "Funny, isn't it?" Alex said, casting a sideways glance at Ryan. "We always talked about the future. I just never thought it would look like this." He chuckled, his voice thick with unspoken memories. Kat's face flushed, but she didn't pull away, knowing that any hint of tension would only give Alex exactly what he wanted. But Ryan wouldn't stand for it. Sliding his arm protectively around Kat, he looked Alex straight in the eyes, his voice calm but firm. "The future is unpredictable," he said with a faint, challenging smile. "But Kat and I are exactly where we want to be." The encounter set off a cascade of subtle mind games between the four of them. Jessica, not to be outdone, began showing up more frequently, feigning friendliness with Kat while inching closer to Ryan whenever Kat's back was turned. Jessica's voice would lower just enough to give their interactions a conspiratorial tone, and she would place a lingering hand on his arm, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Alex, meanwhile, kept pushing Kat's boundaries, bringing up shared memories of places they'd been, things they'd said, and dreams they'd once shared. He'd stand just a bit too close, his eyes filled with an intensity that suggested unfinished business. "We had something real, Kat," he murmured one afternoon, his voice barely a whisper. "Does he even know you like I do?" The psychological warfare weighed heavily on Kat and Ryan's fragile partnership. One night, after Jessica's latest visit, Kat finally broke, her voice laced with anger and frustration. "Is this how it's going to be, Ryan? Our marriage haunted by ghosts of people who think they know us better?" Ryan's jaw tightened, his own frustration seeping through. "And what about Alex? He doesn't exactly seem like he's ready to just wish you well." Silence fell between them, thick and loaded with resentment. But before they could argue further, Jessica's messages started lighting up Ryan's phone, texts filled with cryptic remarks and images from their past, each one dredging up old emotions and sowing seeds of doubt. It was Alex who dealt the final blow, sending Kat an old photo of the two of them together, his arm around her, a caption beneath it, "What might have been." Kat stared at the image, feeling a pang of nostalgia, but also realizing how much she'd moved beyond that life. Fed up, she confronted Alex, her voice sharp and decisive. "Whatever we had, it's over, Alex. I'm building a life with Ryan now, and you're not a part of it." Ryan, too, had a moment of reckoning. He met Jessica for coffee, facing her down and finally speaking the truth that he hadn't fully acknowledged before. "Whatever we had is in the past, Jessica. I've made my choice, and it's time you made yours." Kat and Ryan returned to the estate that night with a newfound clarity, each of them bruised, but understanding something vital. They were not just pawns in the lives of others. They were finally ready to take control of their story, side by side, come what may. The tension simmered as Kat and Ryan tried to settle into their new reality, but it was like trying to find footing on shifting sand. The Montgomerys lived in a world defined by wealth and legacy, and the expectations around marriage were unspoken, yet ironclad. Kat was expected to uphold these traditions, stepping seamlessly into the role of a dutiful wife, poised and perfect at every social function, while Ryan, whose background was far from the country clubs and charity galas, was expected to transform into someone who fit in with the family's high standards. The constant pressure began to weigh on both of them. One evening, Marion, ever the gatekeeper of appearances, decided to throw a formal dinner party to introduce Ryan to the family's elite circle. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of business moguls, socialites, and anyone whose approval Marion deemed crucial. Kat watched her mother direct the staff with a cool authority, her expectations for the night meticulously laid out. Kat knew what Marion wanted, to flaunt her daughter's new husband as a proper extension of the family's wealth and class. Dressed in a tailored suit that Kat had picked out for him, Ryan looked every bit the part, but he could feel the scrutiny of the guests' eyes as they studied him. Marion had prepared him with subtle, loaded advice before the party, hinting at the importance of blending in and upholding the Montgomery reputation. But the pressure grated on him, and every comment from Marion felt like a reminder that he would always be an outsider in this world. Throughout the night, Kat noticed the way the older guests would appraise Ryan, their eyes sliding over him with thinly veiled judgment. A few whispered remarks reached her ears. He doesn't quite have the finesse, does he? She married down, it seems. Her jaw tightened, but Ryan gave her a small smile, as if to say he was used to it, even if it stung. Things came to a head when Kat's father, Tom, pulled Ryan aside during dinner. With a glass of whiskey in hand, Tom spoke with a calm but patronizing tone. "I hope you understand the gravity of this union, Ryan," he said, his eyes hard. "Kat is a Montgomery. We have a reputation to uphold, a legacy. The question is, do you have what it takes to be part of that?" Ryan's eyes flashed, but he kept his composure. "With respect, Mr. Montgomery, I married Kat, not your legacy." The response caught Tom off guard, and for a moment, the older man's mask slipped, revealing a flicker of anger. "Careful," he said, his voice low. "In this family, our legacy is everything." As the evening wore on, Kat and Ryan stole away from the party for a moment, hiding in a quiet corner of the garden. The moonlight cast shadows across Ryan's face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. Kat reached out, brushing her fingers against his. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice soft with apology and frustration. Ryan shook his head. "It's not you, Kat. It's this world." He looked around, his eyes flickering with a mix of disbelief and resentment. "They think because I didn't grow up with their money, I don't deserve you, that I'm some accessory they have to shape to fit their standards." Kat's heart twisted. She'd always known her family's expectations were suffocating, but seeing Ryan struggle with them so openly made it real in a way she hadn't anticipated. "We don't have to live by their rules," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We can do this our way." But it wasn't just her family. They faced resistance from Ryan's side as well. The next day, Ryan's parents, Linda and James, invited them over, an unusual move that immediately put Kat on edge. The Hastings home was warm and lived in, a stark contrast to the Montgomery estate's cold grandeur. But as they settled in, Kat could feel Linda's quiet disapproval in the way she sized up her designer clothes and polished demeanor. "Kat," Linda began, her voice deceptively soft, "Ryan's always been one of us, hardworking, grounded. I know this life with your family is different, but I'd hate to see him lose touch with who he is." The remark was barbed, and Kat felt its sting immediately. She saw Ryan tense beside her, sensing the familiar tug-of-war between his loyalty to his family and his loyalty to her. But before she could respond, Linda continued, her gaze now fixed on her son. "Ryan, dear, you've always been practical. Remember that money doesn't make a marriage, no matter how shiny things may look." The implication was clear. Linda didn't trust Kat's world, didn't believe in the wealth and privilege that had come with their marriage. For her, it was a threat to the grounded life she had envisioned for her son, a life far removed from the social expectations that defined the Montgomerys. The car ride home was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Ryan broke the silence, his tone sharp with frustration. They don't see us, Kat. Not your family, not mine. They see what they want to see, some fantasy of what they think we should be. Kat sighed, glancing over at him. Then we have to show them they're wrong, that we don't have to choose between their expectations and who we are together. That night, they made a silent pact, vowing to build a life on their own terms, even if it meant defying both families. They were done being shaped and molded into someone else's idea of a marriage, and as they looked at each other, they knew that they'd face the inevitable storms as a team, come what may. The tension that had simmered for months finally reached its boiling point one evening at a formal gathering at the Montgomery estate. It was supposed to be a quiet dinner, just family, but the air was charged, everyone on edge as though sensing the impending storm. Kat and Ryan had prepared for this moment, but the magnitude of it was still daunting. They were about to face both families, each holding on to their own set of expectations, mistrust, and judgment, and neither side willing to bend. Marion, dressed impeccably, sat at the head of the table, her gaze a steel trap aimed at Ryan. To her right was Tom, who was uncharacteristically silent, watching Kat with an expression of concern veiled in disappointment. Across from them sat Linda and James, their faces a mixture of quiet disapproval and impatience, as though they couldn't wait to leave the suffocating grandeur of the Montgomery estate. And then, of course, there was Amy, her smirk barely concealed, waiting eagerly to witness the unraveling. As the dinner progressed, Marion leaned forward, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. Ryan, we need to discuss your future plans, our family's future. Kat, as you know, comes from a legacy, one that requires stability and dignity. I'd like to understand how you see yourself fitting into this. Ryan didn't miss a beat. He met Marion's gaze directly, his voice calm, but with an edge that silenced the room. I think it's time to understand that Kat and I are building our own future, one that's not dictated by legacies or status. The statement was like a spark in dry tinder. Tom cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. And what does that mean exactly? He asked, his tone challenging. That you're willing to disregard everything this family has worked for? Worked for? Linda's voice cut in, her eyebrows arching as she looked at Tom. You mean the legacy that's more of a gilded cage than a life? Don't forget, Tom, not everyone sees life as a climb to some social ladder. My son may not have come from wealth, but at least he's not sacrificing his soul for a title. Tom's eyes narrowed, his voice rising with barely restrained anger. With all due respect, Linda, you don't understand what it takes to be part of a family like ours. Kat couldn't take it any longer. She stood, her voice firm and clear. Enough. This is exactly why Ryan and I are choosing our own path. Because none of you can seem to see past your own agendas and ideas of what we should be. We're more than chess pieces on some family board. Amy let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Oh, please, Kat, she sneered. You've always been a dreamer, running off to escape responsibilities, throwing yourself into this marriage like it's some fairy tale. But this isn't a story, Kat. You don't just get to escape. The words hit Kat hard, but Ryan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. Actually, she does. We both do. Because we're done with this constant meddling and manipulation. Jessica, who had been sitting silently on the sidelines, finally spoke up, her voice laced with sarcasm. Well, it's been fun watching this charade unfold. You can't seriously think this us against the world act will hold up. Reality isn't as simple as love conquering all. Kat met Jessica's gaze, unflinching. No, it's not simple, Jessica. But maybe that's the difference between us. You wouldn't understand what it means to stand by someone because you believe in them. The dinner table fell silent, tension crackling in the air. It was Linda who broke it, turning to Marion, her voice colder than ice. Your family may pride itself on its legacy, Marion, but you've done nothing but judge and criticize my son from the moment he entered this house. If this is what dignity looks like, I'd rather we have no part in it. Marion's face turned pale, her polished demeanor cracking as she struggled to maintain control. Your son has disrupted our lives. This marriage was impulsive and irresponsible. Kat doesn't even know what she wants. She's been dragged along in this infatuation. Kat clenched her fists, stepping closer to her mother. No, Mother. I know exactly what I want, And for the first time, it's not dictated by what's expected of me or what you think is right. I want a life that's real, with someone who sees me as a person, not a Montgomery." The silence was deafening. Tom looked as though he wanted to protest, but one look from Kat stopped him. Marion, shaken but unwilling to let her control slip, nodded curtly, her voice tight. "Fine. If that's the life you want, Kat, but don't expect us to be there when it falls apart." Ryan looked at his parents, his expression resolute. "Then we'll do it alone if we have to, because we're done living by anyone else's rules." In that moment, a strange unity fell over Kat and Ryan. They stood together, back to back, as if defending their right to choose their path. The family, now fractured by this brutal confrontation, began to file out, some in silence, others muttering under their breath. As the door closed behind the last guest, Kat and Ryan finally exhaled, looking at each other with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. They had confronted the worst of it, and now, in the quiet aftermath, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, on their own terms.